Have you ever played a game and the animations just feel slightly off? Maybe the jump doesn't have enough weight, or the attacks don't have enough punch to them. As gameplay animators, our job is to make sure that everything not only looks amazing, but feels amazing when you grab that controller and you give the player that experience. Many animators, experienced and inexperienced, focus on flashy animations, but not the fundamental ones. Now, if the basics aren't solid, the whole gameplay suffers. And hiring managers are looking for those fundamentals before they hire anybody. So by the end of this video, you will know the 5 animations that every animator should master and how to improve them. So, without further ado, let's get to it. Welcome to another video. I'm glad you guys are here. This is going to be one that I'm going to try to keep small for all of you to make sure that I go straight to the point and you guys to get the most bang for buck. Now let's start with the 5 animations every animator should know before we delve into the details. Now, the very first one that you need to know is the idle animation. Now, the idle animation is the foundation of the character's personality and is what gives the character the pizzazz, the personality, the movement within the game. You also need to work on your locomotion, such as walk, run cycles, sprint cycles, to make sure that things are smooth. Now, the third thing that you need to actually take into account is jump animations. Now, jumps might seem simple at first when you think about them and you think that it's just a jump, but to implement them is really complex, and I'll go into it a little later. Now, the fourth one is going to be attack animations. Now, this is really broad, but we're going to talk about some ideas and some things that you can focus on, but attack animations pretty much are part of any action, adventure, sci-fi game that you can actually think out there. So having attack animations in your pocket as an animator helps you a ton. And then last but definitely not least is going to be your hit reactions and your deaths. So things that actually kind of like make you off balance, make you fall, make you basically lose as a player because you cannot win all the time. So those are the 5. You actually have your idles, your locomotion, walks and runs and sprints, you have your jump animations, and then you have your attacks, and then finally you have your hit reactions and deaths. Before I go into the solutions on how to get into them, let me talk a little bit about the obstacles of each one of these 5 animations. Now, let's talk about the first thing, the idle, arguably the most important thing that you can master in your gameplay animations. What I see a lot of the time is that they feel too robotic or lifeless. And idles, although simplistic in its nature, because you are just static in one pose, doing nothing but breathing, you'll be fooled to think that there's not much to it. I have worked in places where we can spend a good week or 2 just hammering on an idle to make sure that it looks good, that it suits certain parts of the game, to make sure that the character always is in character, but how much in character, what's the pose that you have to use, is the silhouette correct, can it actually be read properly from all the angles. There's a bunch of things to think about when it comes to the idle, so you need to start thinking about making it less robotic and less static. That's number 1. Now, the obstacle when it comes to the locomotion, such as walks, runs, and sprints, are a lack of weight and lack of natural rhythm when it comes to running. Specifically, the second one, the rhythm part, is one that I see missing all the time. So when you have a young animator that is trying to do a walk or run or sprint, normally it's all about the weight. How weighty do you want it and all that stuff. That's cool, that's number 1, and it takes you maybe a few years to learn it. But over time is the rhythm of it all that actually sells the animation. So the rhythm of a run or rhythm of a walk or rhythm of a sprint is really important for you to sell it. So we talked about the idle, personality, the locomotion, the walks, the runs, the sprints also have personality, and you can sell it with a certain rhythm. And each character has a different type of rhythm when they walk, and this is what creates diversity in the game. Now, the problem with the third obstacle, which is going to be jump animations, normally is to do with either not having a sense of anticipation, with focus on the word sense of anticipation, we'll talk about it in a bit, and landings, not having enough weight when landing on that jump, and also implementation. Implementation of jumps can be incredibly problematic, especially on networked games that are online. The obstacle with the fourth basic animation that you have to learn, which is going to be attacks, is going to be the fact that they feel weak or they don't have a readable motion when you do with them. And you've seen this in many games, perhaps, that as you're mashing the buttons because you're attacking, you don't know what the character is doing, but you know that you're hitting, so you stop looking at the character and you start looking at the middle of the screen where the reticle is, basically allows you to hit. But what's happening on the left screen while the character is moving is just a blur and you cannot read it, right? So there's a lot of games like that. We're going to talk about it in a bit, how to solve it. And last but not least, heat reactions. The obstacles, the problems that I see all the time with heat reactions is that they don't match the force of impact that the character that you're playing is actually exerting. So you can either get hit with heat impact, or you can either hit like enemies with basically a punch or a kick or anything like that. And sometimes, once again, you might have seen games that whenever you kick somebody on the chest or you punch somebody on the face, there's a moment of like, you hit it, there's a heat reaction, and then they fall really slow, or they fall incredibly fast, or they kind of just go flying somewhere else. And it feels odd, right? It feels, you kind of just take it for granted because it's games and you kind of excuse it a little bit. But the trick of the trade is to make sure that these things feel absolutely solid. So you need to make sure that if a punch is hitting and it has a certain force, that force translates to the animation. Now we're going to talk about that as well, on how you can actually make it slightly better. Now these mistakes can make even the best characters, the best games feel floaty and unresponsive. And this is where having a really experienced either lead or director helps a ton, because normally we've been through it enough times that you can basically pinpoint where things are wrong and why the certain characters are not really feeling great. Normally designers cannot say it, or game directors cannot say it. They just know that things don't feel quite right or they don't look quite right. But then it's up to the animation team to find those little gaps and then fix them, right? And this is why it's so good for you to focus on these 5 types of animations, so you can be one of those that actually goes in and goes, this is how you solve it because I've seen it, this is what's missing, and this is how we fix it. Now the good news is that even though it takes you a lifetime to master these skills, animation skills to be exact, there are simple fixes that I'm going to tell you next on how to fix certain things in order to make sure that they don't happen all the time, and it will hopefully get you thinking in a different way as an animator, so you can master these 5 things and you can better your skills as fast as possible. Now, let's start with number 1, the idle. Idles, as mentioned before, they're incredibly complex, and it takes a long time for you to master idles in games, because you kind of have to know the rules of the game, the design of the game, to find out how much of an idle, how big you have to make it or how small you have to make it. So if you think about different genres of games, so for example you have League of Legends, the camera is incredibly far away, you stop down and you're looking down at the character that is like this small, so you need to make the idle bigger so you can see it. Otherwise, if you make it still, the character won't move very much. But if you have like more of a third-person single-player game, normally the camera is just behind the character. Normally you can see from the hip up, and that's about it, so you're very zoomed in on the character, and also the camera moves in and out of the character, so you have to take those things into consideration. But the one thing is true: no idle should be super still or should be lifeless. So in order for you to actually add more life to your idles, make sure that the breathing, what happens here, doesn't happen mechanically, but in fact happens organically. There's a lot of things that happen when you breathe, and you don't breathe the same way like very often. You can breathe a little bit in or a little bit out, or you can breathe a lot in and a lot out, but we all kind of do things not equally, so we will actually breathe a little bit in certain situations and like breathe a lot in certain other situations. So you need to mix and match to make sure that that breathing motion feels not only good and natural, but also you mix it up. So if you have a long idle and the only thing that is happening is breathing, make sure that within that breathing idle you have different types of movements. Even though they are small, they are different enough that makes it look a little bit more organic, right? Now, blinking and facial and head movement is another thing that you can do. And within the idle, in games there's things called idle breaks. And this is basically the idea that you have one main idle that is very long and he plays, this one is the most neutral idle that you can have. But then you can have within that idle variations of the idle in order to basically mix and match the animations. And the idea here is that if I'm a player and I'm playing the game and all that stuff, and then I put my controller down and then I leave it alone, we all been in that screen that basically the character is doing nothing and you're just staring at it. And animators think about this a lot because we paid attention to every single animation. So if that's the case, what is the character doing when you put the controller down? And this is basically the idea that they're not only looking forward for the first maybe minute or so, but after maybe a minute or a few seconds, they start kind of like looking around and seeing what's going on, right? And then maybe the third movement is a little bit bigger, and now they are moving their feet a little bit, if you can, in your game, depending on the rules. And then maybe the third one is even bigger. Maybe they sit down, right? Or something along those lines. So that's the idea of mixing and matching your animations to create variation within one animation. This will happen for every single thing that I mentioned here, but just know that for the idle, it's super important to have idle breaks, because if you don't have them, the animation starts to look samey. And even if you have the longest idle possible, when the player is playing the game for a long period of time, you will see that idle so often that it looks repetitive. And the idea of having animation variation is to basically break down that repetitiveness so it looks like the character is always doing something interesting, even if the player is not interacting with it, right? Now, the biggest tip that I can give you here in order for you to improve your idles is to study real life behavior, because you will know what feels good in real life and you will know how much you can exaggerate your movement based on the game that you are doing, right? Because one movement of me taking reference of myself, for example, of me doing this and basically moving around might be one thing. When I translate it to a game, it might be too small. And maybe I'm working for a League of Legends and I have to exaggerate this movement so it can be more like this, right? And this is the idea of picking up on something realistic and then pushing it further. So studying real life and taking reference of yourself, looking at other people's reference, YouTube, video referencing is absolutely everything when it comes to idles. Now, the second animation that you have to master is your locomotions, your walks, your runs, and your sprints. Now, this, at first, it's all about getting the weight right. This is a tricky one because depending on the size of the character, depending on the energy of the character, depending on how far you go with the character, depending on the strides of the character, the leg length, there's a bunch of different things that you have to take into account here when it comes to doing something that feels right. But no matter which character you actually decide to actually use, making sure that the weight shifts when running or walking are correct is super important. Also, making sure that you have fluid movement within your walk or run or sprint cycle is also super important, because there's nothing that actually sticks out more than basically not having something fluid on a cycle. It's called a cycle because it needs to basically revert back to the same thing in a super smooth way. And if it's really smooth, you should be invisible to the player whenever they play it. Now, I talked here about metrics in a video that I will basically link somewhere. And metrics are super important for you to know how big of a stride the character has, how smooth can you make it, and all these things that I just talked about weight shifts. You need to look at the rules of the game that have been hopefully set up already for you by design, or maybe if you're a new animator into a studio, maybe they've been working on it for a while. You can ask your lead, ask your seniors, what is the metrics for the run? Like how far can a character run or sprint or walk? It's going to be 3 different metrics depending on what the character is doing, and only within those metrics you need to make your animation. And this is very important for you to learn, that working within the rules or working within the parameters given to you by design is super important so your animation matches what's needed. Otherwise, what you end up with is basically walks and runs that are all walking and running at different speeds in game, and it becomes a mess. So we need to metric so all characters are running at the same speed, so it doesn't feel unfair. It's one of the rules that we have a lot at the time in animation, because the more you practice, the less afraid you're going to be to make any walk cycle or sprint cycle. And that's one of the things that people are more afraid of in games. And there's always one animator within any studio that is really good at doing walk cycle and sprint cycles and stuff. And this stuff, especially when it's hand key, normally goes to that one guy. So try to be that one person that basically, is really good at doing like, locomotion in general. Now, jump animation is a third animation that you have to master. Now, in games, there's normally 3 phases to a jump. There is actually an into, a loop, and then an out of. And the reason why this is set up this way is normally to do with code engineering. Also, so you can basically extend certain things in animation. So basically when you want to jump, if I'm in an idle, I go like this. This is an into the jump, right? So you can build your anticipation in the jump if you can, and I'll go into it in a bit. And then you have your looping motion, which is then going to be like the animation that you probably have seen in games, that the character just does this thing for the longest time. And the reason why that's there is so you can basically fall off a cliff, and the cliff can be like 20 meters long, and the character can just be looping for that long until basically just before the ground hits. That's when the land hits, right? So this is why you have a looping motion. And then you have the landing motion, which is going to be pretty much like the beginning, but you're just going to like land and then recover and go back into idle. Now, those 3 phases are separated in game, but for you, the animator, you need to make them blend. Because if the player, for any reason, as they are playing, they hit that button, and the only thing they do is hit the jump button, and then they jump, and they see your whole animation happening in one go, it needs to be seamless, right? So it's split into 3, but it needs to be seamless as one, which is the thing that is difficult to master in the beginning, because it kind of breaks your brain a little bit to think that you need to split it into 3, and then the loop needs to loop, but it needs to actually be okay. So try to actually practice, this is my tip, try and actually practice this like 3 movement loop over jump as much as possible, because if you can sell that anticipation, if you can sell that fall and the weight on that jump, and if you can sell like a really good loop on that like middle section, you're gonna be golden. Same thing as the loop here. Try to actually look at reference, at footage of jumps to see how they can be translated to a game jump, because game jumps are different. They're going to have different heights. They're going to have different weights. Somebody that's a little bit bigger is going to jump a little different than somebody that is athletic, right? So keep those things in mind, look at a lot of reference, and practice separating those 3 different phases in your jumps, and try to make it as seamless as possible. Now, attack animations, the 4th animation that you need to master, you need to make sure that they feel powerful. Now, this can mean different things for different animations. So let's say, for those that know Bruce Lee, you have a 1-inch punch. So you actually are here and you actually hit. Now, if you watched any of those movies, you will know that those things actually still feel incredibly powerful, even though they are just this long. Or you can have punches that start from here and then really hit hard. So the distance between what you are punching and you, the puncher, is actually going to matter a lot when it comes to the impact and the force that you're going to translate forward. Now, like everything in nature, when you hit something, there's a reaction on the other end, and the body, the person, the object needs to react accordingly. So in reality, when you're working in most of the attacks, you are attacking something. So normally you have to have 2 people kind of like working in tandem. So most of the attack animations that I've worked normally is one person, which is basically the player, either throwing something or hitting something, and then they have the person that's going to get hit, which is basically that 5th animation that you have to master, which is the hit reaction. So now normally you work on them at the same time, and the distance between them needs to be consistent. Once again, going back to the design and the rules of the game, you need to make sure that if it's a meter away, that punch needs to come at a meter, they need to connect and then disconnect. And attacks in games are all about connecting and disconnecting all the time, because the moment that you throw that punch, those animations are basically connected in this 1 millisecond, and then they disconnect again, and the character needs to fall off, and then you as a player need to chase that character again to then punch him again. So there's a lot of like a dance to it. But for you, the animator, the only thing you have to focus on is making sure that your attacks, let's say, is a meter apart, you place the 2 characters in front of each other. How powerful can you make it to go from attack idle, which can be just like a pose like this, to then punching and then going back? Does that feel powerful? How does the character react? It's great stuff. Now, the fifth animation that you're going to have to master is going to be hit reacts and death animations. And you can basically work with attack animations and hit reacts kind of like at the same time, because remember, for the attacks, you need to have somebody in front of the attacker just to make sure that he hits right. So as you are hitting your attacks and you work on your attacks first, make sure you have somebody to hit and they react to the punch or they die from the punch, and then try to make those animations as interesting as possible, because those animations are probably going to get implemented in game at the same time. That attack corresponds to a certain hit react, and then basically as you kind of putting the animation systems together, they know that if I'm doing this specific attack, the character needs to react in a certain way, or the physics take over sometimes, and then they have like all kinds of random attacks. But either way, you need to use something to actually have reference of how certain attacks are going to propagate. And even if the hit react or the death doesn't make it to game because it's all physics, at least the engineers or the technical animators and the more technical people that are basically implementing your animations, they get to see the force of that impact, right, from a visual standpoint, and they can replicate those things in engine. Now, the tip that I can give you here for the hit reacts is for you to create hit reacts of different lengths so they can have different impacts, right? So hit reactions are going to be things like you get hit, you go back, and then you go forward, right? So that's basically you reacting to something. Deaths are gonna be like you get hit, you fall down like a sack of potatoes, and then you die. Now, deaths are gonna be different. If you have a game that is going to be like Sifu, for example, they're gonna be very flamboyant. Maybe the character punches and the enemy just like flies in the air and flip-flops and then falls down. Or it can be very much like, you know, very realistic death, such as a punch and then the person just, you know, passes out and falls on the floor. So try to play around with like length and weight of the death, because that will help, and also for the hit reacts as well. Now, to recap everything, right, and conclude everything. So you have to learn 5 animations, and those 5 animations are going to be your idles, your locomotion, walks, runs, and sprints. It's also going to be your jumps, it's going to be your attacks, and it's going to be your deaths and hit reactions. If you have those as a gameplay animator, you are going to be in a great place, because those are going to be the animations that you're going to do the most often as you progress through your career. Now, obviously, as you become a better animator and more experienced animator, you are going to be faster, better, you're going to be able to actually adjust these things, and you're going to know which buttons to press whenever somebody asks you for either a tweak or a specific thing within a game. But as a junior animator, I know for a fact that I struggled a lot to get my head around what do you mean metrics, or what do you mean it needs to be stronger or shorter or more impactful? How does that translate to game? And the game aspect of things and the implementation side of things is the thing that actually kind of like confuses your brain so much, right? So try to actually do these things, try to kind of like practice these things, and try to implement them in a creative way, because doing them just for the sake of doing them and doing an idle just for the sake of doing an idle is great for your personal tests. But if you're going to put it in your show reel, make sure that whatever you put in your show reel has these things, but with a creative flair to it. The creative flair bit is incredibly important, because this is what's going to separate your work from others. And when people see certain implementations of hit reacts or attacks or even idles that are made in a really creative way, immediately they can connect that this person can do this for us, and therefore we need to get this person. So practice, analyze games, and good animation, and everything will fall into place. Now, please leave a comment down below and let me know which of these 5 animations are the ones that you struggle with the most. Don't forget to subscribe, like, and comment, and as usual, stay well, stay safe. Peace.